Welcome, and we should be going live on Facebook at the same time in the 74th group. So,
Oh. Oh. Oh, this is your meeting.
there we go. Who else do I have to admit? And it's live on Facebook, so we've got that going. Which people can comment there, but they won't be able, we won't see their comments here. So, but it also keeps it to where folks go back and view it, so.
It hasn't started yet.
Brett,
Yeah.
is Lexi your daughter?
Yes, Lexi's my daughter. I think she's
Where does she live?
in Manassas.
Hi, Mr.
Hey,
Fleck.
Flax, how are you?
She just can't wait to be back at another Civil War battlefield.
I think it'll be awesome.
How are
She's
you,
grown
Mr.
up,
Fleck?
Adam. Hey, now I'm old. Wow. Old and embarrassed in both. That's hilarious. I think it's great your dad wants to drag you around battlefields again. That's awesome.
He didn't even know I was joining.
Well, we pointed out the fact that you were registered and he was not, and he was the speaker, spoke volumes. So.
I'm not shocked.
Okay, so I'm admitting folks. He just needs staff, Lexi. He just needs staff.
Hey, John.
In the time. I have those two things. Okay, I think, sorry. Can't do that yet. Look at all these things showing up on my screen. All right, we'll wait. It's 4 o'clock. We'll wait 1 more minute. And with that, then we'll get started. These are like people. I mean, I know names. It's like, this is the real person. Like, this is great. Lexi's all grown up and saving the world now. That just makes me old. Hey, Brett, if you weren't aware, you're old. Just
Well, I should post a picture of her when she was like 7, walking on top of a cannon in Gettysburg.
yeah, exactly. You know, every now and then I come across that picture too, and I figure I could use this. And I'm like, no, that's just no.
When I go to Manassas, I still do the stomach thing that Anastasia and I used to do on them.
Oh, yeah. I was trying to convince her to be on here, and if not, they're doing other things. I'm like, whatever. My grandfather would say they're out of the will. Yeah, they would say would say they're out of the will in our family, but they'd question whether they were ever in it. So, okay, well, it's 4:01, and so what I want to do is kind of get started, and that way we can devote a lot of our time to letting Bret talk. I think folks will find that real interesting. This is a great opportunity for all of us who are descendants of the 74th Pennsylvania Infantry. And it's awesome that you can participate in this forum. I'm Rod Fleck. I'm out in Forks, Washington. Co-organizers for this endeavor were Bret, and he's in Woodbridge, and John, who's in Herndon, Virginia. So we literally have coast to coast here and every point in between. We're not going to have a lot of time for introductions. Everybody's got their names there. I'd ask you to mute yourself at the beginning. And what we're going to do is try to do the questions in the chat, and we'll just watch the time is the big thing. John had asked, hey, Rod, what has been the goal, or, could you articulate the goals of the 74th Descendants, the Facebook page and the website, which needs more attention from me. But, and I was like, okay, well, here's what kind of comes to my mind. Basically keep the faith. I'm a member of the Sons of Union Vets of the Civil War. To us, it's a big deal to remember who these men were, what they fought for, what they did, etc., and how to retain that historical knowledge, and then also function as a focal point for information sharing. And we've done that for 2 decades, which is really, really hard for me to believe. But then, seeing Lexi all grown up and trying and doing things reminds me that, it's probably been 2 decades. We also advocate and contribute. We've had some situations where, as descendants of the 74th, we have had to make inquiries to the Park Service as to why certain things weren't done when the monument was hit a couple times on Howard Avenue at Gettysburg, advocate for flag preservation, and so, and help raise a little bit of money here and there for battlefield preservation where our ancestors were at. So that, that's kind of our goal, but also to share stuff of what we learn, because every family has different stories. Those stories are helpful, and we'll get to how that can be helpful to somebody who swears he's writing a book. That's what he pretends. I mean, he says. So this is our first Zoom meeting. Obviously, we're from 5:30. We're going to be done. We're going to be done at 5:30. So we probably won't have a lot of real-time dialogue. But that said, send the comments and questions you got into the chat. We'll try to, John and I will try to grab Bret and wave there. I'm going to make Bret the host here in a second. And it's being recorded and put on Facebook Live. So if you missed something, it'll be on Facebook. I will also talk to a buddy of mine and have him kind of spend some time, if he can, real quick editing and put it up on the YouTube channel I have that I haven't posted things on forever. So, Lexi, you can take some solace in the fact that I don't think your dad did that to you like I did that to my kids. So, that's probably a good thing. But it'll be on the Facebook page. And so you can go back and watch it and listen to it as well. Our main event is going to be Bret, and he's going to give about an hour presentation. We talked about certain areas to talk about, and depending on how things are going, we might just open it up where we can let people in the chat or on basis ask questions. I'm also going to put up a specific poll, and I'll do that now while I'm talking, I just have to find this. And basically it's, should we try to get together in 2022? If so, spring or summer. And that may say like, oh, that's so far away. When Bret and I helped arrange the one back a long time ago, it took us about a year to get everything in place. We had talked about it, and then it took 4 or 5 months for us to actually get what we could organize, and then get us organized, and then everybody else organized. And so once this is done, the next question is, which is better, spring or fall? I'm a wimp. I live in the Northwest. I don't do your East Coast summers at all. And so, that's the
key thing is if you want to do it in a manicured battlefield like Gettysburg, you can do it during the summer, no problem. If you want to do like Chancellorsville, those of you who know Virginia forests, there's a lot of undergrowth, so you can't do it in the summer. You have to do it in the winter.
I just go by, okay, what's the temperature and the humidity? Those are my guides, So I'm going to close that one out real quick. And then it looks like that's something. So we'll start working on that. And so there's the results. And on that one. And then we should be able to go to cancel. So that's that question. And then we should be able to go to the second one. And I just want to do this that way I can start talking to Bret and them. And be able to go to question 2, which is spring or fall of 2022. And we'll plan accordingly. And then with that, I'm gonna say we've also got the opportunity to do this by Zoom again, in a few months, if that is of interest to folks, where we can get together and either Bret or other folks share information with their stories, or give everybody who signs in, hey, you got 5 minutes. What's your 5-minute story on your ancestor? That might be a really good one to do as well. And let this go just a couple more seconds. It looks like everybody's voted, so I'll do that. And it looks like we're going to look at fall of 2022. So September, October-ish. So I think that's decent weather back there in Virginia. And we'd probably do something Virginia, Pennsylvania, somewhere like that. I mean, it's going to be closer to you guys than me. Well, I think there's a few folks from California. So, all right. So, we'll have to plan that. But that's what you hit your dad up for. That's what my kids will tell me when I tell them this is what we're doing. All right. With that, so I'm going to make Bret the host and let him start this and go for it. Bret, it's your turn to start talking.
Okay. Now, I'm going to talk a little bit about, how the regiment, the genesis of the regiment, which is a very, very complicated thing that happened. It's not your typical regiment that was raised in a single area and with a single man, leading the charge. But with that, I'll actually start with the man who was the most instrumental, which was Alexander Schimmelpfennig, who was an immigrant from Prussia. He was from a family that was very influential and well known. They had a long military history. He joined the military when he was 17 years old as a private, which is typical for aristocracy. They would join at 17 as a private. They'd have to serve in the ranks for a minimum of 6 months before they would become a Swordnot-Fähnrich, which is basically a cadet. And they would have to then go to a military academy for a year before they would get promoted. But they had to go through a long process. Before they even got in, they had to get admitted. They would have to meet with the colonel of the regiment they wanted to get into and get the entire mess of officers would have to all vote to approve this person coming on board. In the case of Schimmelpfennig, the regiment that he was trying to get into happened to be the regiment his father had served in during the Napoleonic Wars. So he had a very close relationship with those folks. And he served in that regiment in Koblenz, which was the major Prussian city on the Rhine, which at the time he was there in the 1840s was known as the Hungry 40s. There was a famine. There was a lot of social unrest. Somewhere on the order of 25 to 30% of the city was receiving food aid. But so it was a powder keg. But while he was there, he met his future wife, and his wife Sophia von Glümer, who was the daughter of the chief judge of the Prussian courts of the Rhineland. So he made a great connection there. Then he was sent to Cologne in 1848. And he was there when there was, Cologne was the hotbed of socialist thought. The foundation of the Communist Party was there. He became very involved with that. He got to know Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels and the whole crew. And then he volunteered to serve with the rebels in Schleswig-Holstein, which rebelled against Danish rule at that time. And he joined a unit there and fought and got firsthand experience fighting on the battlefield. He was wounded several times. He was breveted to captain. And when he returned in September of 1848, to Cologne, there was great dissatisfaction across Germany because the Prussian government had cut a deal with the Danes on Schleswig-Holstein, and it was called the Malmö Accords, and it was seen as a betrayal by the king of the German nationalists in Schleswig-Holstein. And this was a big deal. This affected not just him. It affected a lot of Germans, and a lot of Germans who would end up in the 74th Pennsylvania. The Schleswig-Holstein War kindled German nationalism in a way it hadn't been for half a century. And so this was a really big deal. And when he returned in September of 1848, his colonel, who was a very fierce right-wing conservative gentleman, aristocracy, decided that he had imbibed too much in liberalism and in nationalism, and he kicked him out of the army and said, you're no longer going to be here. This is not for you because you don't support the king. So Schimmelpfennig went with about a dozen other Prussian officers, and they banded together and ended up in South Germany in Baden, and in the Bavarian Palatinate, which is the Saarland now. And while they were there, the revolution broke out, the 1849 revolution, and Schimmelpfennig was given the rank of major and was put in command of a significant number of troops, a division of troops, 5,000 men. And they fought the Prussian invasion that was sent to destroy the Revolutionary Army. He was in a battle in the mountains and was severely wounded. He was shot through the groin and in the leg. But he continued to stay with the army. He fought in several more battles until they retreated into Switzerland. He recovered in Switzerland, and at that time, he got to know Karl Schurz, who is an extremely famous American. He was Secretary of Interior. He was a two-term senator from Missouri. he met Schimmelpfennig, and he, as a young man, he was in college, and Schimmelpfennig taught him military tactics. This would serve him very well because during the Civil War, he became a major general and actually was Schimmelpfennig's boss for a large part of the war, and including at Gettysburg. But Carl Schurz at this point became very, very famous around the world because he broke into Spandau prison by himself with support from a Russian German aristocrat. She gave him the money. And he broke into Spandau prison and got out his former teacher, who was a famous, revolutionary, and smuggled him on a boat to England. And it was considered the most amazing escape story in Europe at the time. It was all over every newspaper. And both Schurz and Schimmelpfennig, because they were working together very closely now, both were sentenced to death in absentia by the Prussian government. They both set up a revolutionary organization in Switzerland and were chased out of Switzerland, went to Paris, chased out of Paris, went to London. He spent a lot of time traveling into Germany incognito to raise money and to try to get the Landwehr, the reserve army in Prussia, to overthrow the government. Didn't work. And he finally decided that there was no hope of a revolutionary Germany. And so he decided to sail to America. He got married to Sophia, and they took a boat, and in 1852 came to Philadelphia and settled down there. He wrote a book about the Crimean War, but really struggled financially. He had a very difficult time. But then his brother-in-law who was a very, very well-known map maker, Edward Frehold. He brought him to Washington, and Frehold was extremely well known because he had drawn the first map of the Western United States that had been done based on the surveys done for the railroads. So he put together the first detailed map of the United States, and so he brought Schimmelpfennig to Washington, D.C., and he began working as a draftsman for the War Department, making maps as a consultant, and that's where he was, in 1860, and when the elections were going on. And this is where it starts to get complicated for the regiment, because at this point, multiple threads start to come together about how the regiment was organized. One of the key events was in December of 1860 in Pittsburgh. The Secretary of War at the time was a Southern sympathizer under the Buchanan administration. And he decided that it would be opportune time before President Lincoln was sworn into office to ship 120 cannon from the Allegheny Armory, where they were manufacturing naval guns, down to New Orleans to use for the Confederacy. And as they were actually moving the guns from the armory to the riverboats on the Monongahela, the whole city exploded. There were all kinds of people blockading the streets, threatening the soldiers. They mounted cannon on the heights above the three rivers. So if the ships tried to sail, they were going to sink them. And eventually, the colonel in charge of the Allegheny Armory kept sending telegrams saying, "Look, this is getting out of hand. I need to know what to do. It's dangerous. There's going to be bloodshed here if we load any more of these cannons." And he finally got a telegram back from the Attorney General saying, "Stop, return the guns." by the time he started to return the guns, people had already got on the boat and had spiked a bunch of them. So it had gotten that dangerous. But that really motivated a lot of people in Pittsburgh, that this was literally the first instance where there was resistance by Northerners to what was going on. And, it was armed resistance. I mean, it came very close to bloodshed. And this motivated a lot of the German community there. And because a lot of the Germans in Pittsburgh were Democrats, and they were not particularly enamored with the idea of going to war. But these were also people that had fled Germany. Many of them were nationalists and believed in the Union, because they saw in Germany all these small countries that made it a weak country. And it was divided, and there were, you had a king or a duke, and when they came here, they did not want to see this country fall apart. They were very, very passionate nationalists in this country as well. And so a lot of these folks that would not otherwise have rallied around because of what happened in December, they were suddenly, well prepared to start joining the Union Army as early as January, before there even was a call up of soldiers. They started organizing and getting ready to pull together. And, this was being done, by priests. There was one of the priests at St. Michael's was a former missionary in Bulgaria, a Muslim state. He was a converted Jew, and he decided that this was something that was important. He was anti-slavery, so he, unlike most Catholic priests, and including the Catholic Bishop of Pittsburgh, he was advocating fight for the Union, fight against slavery. So this was very unique in this sort of a situation. And then to pull us back a little bit out of Pittsburgh, go to Schimmelpfennig again. Schimmelpfennig became a U.S. citizen on January 10th, which just happened to be the day after the Star of the West was fired upon at Charleston Harbor, which was the first shot of the Civil War. And that was the very first shot of the Civil War. And the Star of the West was trying to bring supplies into Charleston, and it was driven off. That was the day that he became a U.S. citizen, which was somewhat auspicious. And he decided that he was going to, he decided at that point that he was going to try to raise volunteers to fight for the Union. And he decided that, he didn't know quite what to do, but he started talking to his friend Carl Schurz, and Schurz had decided he wanted to do the same thing. And so, they had talked off and on, but then in April of 1861, after Virginia seceded, there was a blockade put into place around the city of Washington. And it involved, there was a pro-Confederate militia in Prince George's County that cut off the road north and the railroad north and to Philadelphia, to Baltimore and to Philadelphia. And Schimmelpfennig decided he was going to try anyways. He was going to try to get to Philadelphia and try to raise a regiment of troops for Lincoln. He made it to Laurel. I don't know how many of you know Washington, D.C., but he made it to Laurel and was forced to turn back because Confederates, at that time, they were just militiamen from Prince George's County, but they ended up being part of the 1st Maryland Cavalry, which was a Confederate unit. But they fired on Schimmelpfennig and forced him to go back to D.C. So he got back and he was trying to figure out what to do. And a few days later, General Butler had landed in Annapolis and taken over the city. And Schurz was able to get through on the first train that got through to DC from Annapolis. And so he and Schimmelpfennig got together and decided they were going to try to raise a regiment with Germans from DC, Baltimore, Philadelphia, and New York. So this was the first concept of a regiment, of a German regiment. They were going to try to draw from all the four of these things. So then Schimmelpfennig tried to get out again and head north, and he pretended to be a surveyor, and he was able to convince them that he was just out surveying, and they ignored him and let him go. And so he made his way up to Philadelphia. Now, at this time, he had also done something which was remarkable, in that he wrote a letter that was published on April 19th, 1861, in the Der Wecker, which is called The Alarm, Der Wecker, which was a German language newspaper published in Baltimore. And in that letter, he called for all Germans in America to rise up and support the Union and to fight the Confederacy. That day was the day of the Baltimore riots. And Confederate sympathizers broke into the Turner Hall and into the Wecker building and destroyed it, burned them to the ground. And so that really caused a big fleeing from Baltimore of Germans. Some fled to Washington, some fled up to Philadelphia, more fled to Philadelphia. So at that point, Schimmelpfennig decided he wasn't going to get very far in Baltimore. So he decided to focus all his efforts in Philadelphia. And he got to Philadelphia, and he started working with brewers, beer lager makers who were very wealthy. And all these lager producers decided to support him in a significant way. And they got him a campground. They put in money to raise troops. And during June and July, he was able to raise 7 companies of soldiers. And then he had the great misfortune of coming down with smallpox, which he had already been in Germany. He had been vaccinated, but he got smallpox, which basically knocked him out for 2 weeks, which was a bad thing, because during this 2 weeks, all these other rich guys in Philadelphia decided there were 58 different people who were colonels in Philadelphia. And so they all started poaching his unit, his companies. Only one company remained loyal. One of the companies that went with the 75th Pennsylvania, and it would actually led to a tragedy there. Those men that went to the 75th ended up out on the Shenandoah River in the spring of 1862, and 58 of them died because the boat they were on overturned during a storm, and they all drowned. They were swept away and drowned in the Shenandoah River. So that's a sad story, but those were men that should have been in the 74th, but they left. But then, when he recovered, the Secretary of War at that point had been told, well, he's a failure, so we want to revoke his authority to raise a regiment. And they did that. Well, then all his friends sprung to life in Washington, D.C., and started writing letters and contacting, powerful politicians around the country, and said, no, we need Schimmelpfennig. And there were all kinds of notices put out all over the country. And finally, the Secretary of War gave in and put out a notice across all the major newspapers of the United States saying Schimmelpfennig's authority had been reinstated. He was given 30 days to come up with a regiment. Well, that was tough when you only have one company still left with you. Coincidentally, in Pittsburgh, General Fremont had passed through town the month before and had met with some German Americans there and said, hey, if you guys can raise a regiment, I'll support you. You come out to St. Louis, where I am, and you guys can serve with me. So these guys in Pittsburgh, most of them were 48ers. They had been revolutionaries. Said, okay, we'll do this. We'll do this for General Fremont. So they started raising a regiment in Pittsburgh from the Turner Hall and various other organizations and bringing folks together. And within about a month, they were able to have 8 companies, but they didn't have a colonel. You know, this was a committee. These guys weren't soldiers. This gentleman by the name of Gritzner in Washington, D.C., who was a friend of Schimmelpfennig, and if any of you know the history of sewing machines, Gritzner was the first singer. He sold millions and millions of the mechanical sewing machines. He was the first sewing machine manufacturer in the world. He said, hey, I have a friend and he needs a regiment. You guys have a regiment and you need a colonel. So he said, this is a marriage made in heaven. And they agreed. And they sent a letter to Schimmelpfennig in Philadelphia and said, please, you know, if you want our regiment, we've got the men. And so he said, yes, he agreed to that. So he left Adolf von Hartung, who is, I think some of you saw, I put a little thing up on him on the Facebook page. He left him in charge in Philadelphia, and he went to Pittsburgh, and started whipping the regiment into shape. And very quickly they were ready to go. And on September 14th, they were mustered in as a regiment in Pittsburgh and put on a train. And they went to Philadelphia, where they picked up the rest of the men, Company A, which was well, I take that back. The Company K, Company A, which was on Hartung, they went on a separate adventure, because after first Bull Run and on the 21st of June or July, the Union had panicked and said, if we got any organized troops anywhere in the world, we want to put them into uniforms and get them out. So those 80 men that were in Company A under Captain von Hartung were enrolled into service on the 4th of August, and they were sent to Fort Delaware, which is on Peapatch Island in the Delaware River at its defense of Philadelphia. Now, the interesting thing about them is they were there for 6 months, and they were called cheeseheads by the other company that was there, which were an Irish company. But the commander of the Irish company was a chef, and the general in command was very, very happy with this guy. So he took care of the Irish. They could do whatever they wanted. The Germans who were there, they had to take care of all the pig poop and hay, digging and cleaning and all the hard work, and all they were fed was cheese, and they were called cheeseheads by the Irish, and they were very miserable. And Captain von Hartung wrote a letter every week for 6 months saying, let me go, let my people go. And eventually they let him go, and they rejoined the regiment in Virginia in February of 1862. But when they were coming back, when the Pittsburgh contingent went to Philadelphia and then was going down to DC, as they were riding through the town from one train station to the other in Philadelphia, Schimmelpfennig's horse stumbled on the bricks, and he fell and broke his ankle and was out of commission for several months. So the regiment went on without him. The lieutenant colonel in command was Edward Frehold, his brother-in-law, and so he took the regiment down to Virginia, and they became very famous among the residents of Fairfax County, because and they sent the civilians of Fairfax County sent multiple letters to the commanding general on a repeated basis, because they kept complaining about these drunken Germans who would go around and steal things from all these, Confederate sympathizer houses. And, they kept saying, and all these Union officers kept coming and complaining to that the Germans were making them look badly. And as far as the men of at that point, the 35th Pennsylvania Regiment, which was actually the 74th, they had the wrong designation for about 6 months. There were two regiments that were the 35th Pennsylvania, and that was an accident of the bureaucracy. But it was fixed on the 1st of January 1862. But there were all these complaints about these Germans from the 35th Pennsylvania harassing disloyal Americans in Fairfax County. And they seemed to enjoy it. The men loved the idea if they saw anyone who they suspected was being disloyal of going out and scaring them every night. So it was, they had something of a reputation for during that fall. They were fairly healthy, but then in January of 1862, there was a diphtheria epidemic, and quite a few people got sick. They lost a couple hundred people that had got sick and that they lost from the rolls. They also lost Edward von Freyhold, a lieutenant colonel, because his family lived in Washington, D.C., and his three oldest boys all caught diphtheria. They ranged in age from 6 to 2. And they all caught diphtheria and died within a week. And so he resigned his commission and went back to DC to care for the rest of his family. And then Schimmelpfennig at that point was still not able to come back. And Major Ham from Pittsburgh took over, and he was not a popular guy. And most of the officers conspired very quickly to get rid of him. And eventually, Schimmelpfennig did come back in the early spring, and he sent Ham on a recruiting mission, which in Pittsburgh, which he remained at for 2 years. So even though he was the senior ranking officer in the regiment, he wasn't there. He wasn't allowed to come back. And the correspondence between him and Captain von Hartung is quite remarkable and actually very, very funny, because he keeps sending letters saying, I am the boss, and, you have to let me come back. And von Hartung would write him back and say, well, you might have the rank, but you're not coming back. And don't do anything like actually recruit anybody, because we won't take anybody you recruit. So that kind of went on for a year and a half. But that point was when McClellan finally decided to move the Army of the Potomac and stir to action, because Lincoln was all over him about not actually moving. And they had marched out to Fairfax and were ready to go wherever they were going to go. And at that point, McClellan decided, well, I'm going to move the army down to the Virginia Peninsula, but I'm going to leave the Germans. I'm not going to take them with me. And so they were in a German general's name. Blenker was the general. And they decided, we're going to move you to West Virginia to join General Fremont and his army that was supposed to be clearing the Shenandoah Valley. Well, I know you all know the distance between Fairfax and Winchester. You can drive that in an hour. It took them 33 days to march. The winter was one of the worst winters in history, recorded history. There was snow on the ground. They had no maps. They were lost. They started out as 10,000 men. By the time they got to their destination in Monterey, West Virginia, there were 5,000. So it was a disastrous march. It really sapped them. When they got to Monterey, they didn't have any shoes. They didn't have any tents. They were sleeping on the snow. And it was a really, truly miserable, existence for the men. And they had to go from there directly into combat with Jackson and his troops. They fought their first battle at Cross Keys, and they actually credited themselves fairly well at Cross Keys. They suffered their first few casualties there, and then they marched across the mountains and were near the Battle of Cedar Mountain, but they weren't engaged. And after that point, they went into encampment near Sperryville, and they spent a couple months in Sperryville, where they basically pulled themselves back together. They got supplies, they got new uniforms, they were able to get some new weapons, and they were able at that point to become, a more professional organization, one that was able to succeed and survive on the land. Then they moved out from there, and they were in the Bull Run campaign, the second Bull Run, and in that they fought their second battle, which was Freeman's Ford. And Freeman's Ford, I don't know if any of you know the geography of Virginia very well, but it was out on the Rappahannock River, just north of Culpeper. It was just a few miles away from Culpeper. And the regiment was with two other regiments, the 61st Ohio, which would become its sister regiment for 2 years, and the 8th West Virginia. And they decided to do a reconnaissance. Schurz thought this would be a great idea, make a reconnaissance across the river. And what they didn't realize was when they crossed the river, the three regiments, it was, together there were maybe 1,200 men. They actually cut right between Jackson's and Longstreet's corps. Longstreet was coming up from the south. Jackson was just moving to the north, and they ran into Jackson's, his mule trains, and seized a bunch of mules and supplies, and unleashed a torrent of response. They were immediately assaulted from the south by the Texas Brigade, and they were assaulted from the north by Trimble's division. They were heavily outnumbered. There were maybe 1,200 men facing over 10,000. And they had to fall back very quickly toward the river. The 8th West Virginia broke under assault by the 21st North Carolina, and ran, leaving the 61st Ohio and the 74th by themselves. The 74th was facing aid by itself. And at that point, they decided that they would never make it back across the river, because the river was rising. It had been low when they crossed, but there had been rain and the river had risen. And so they were in a big conundrum that if they tried to run, the Confederates would be right on top of them. And there's a ridge that overlooks the river where the ford is. So the Confederates would have the high ground to shoot down on them. And so they made it to the river. But what they had done in the meantime was they decided they had to buy some time. So Schimmelpfennig decided, we're going to make a bayonet charge. My 800 men are going to charge those 10,000 men and scare the hell out of them. And they did. They charged them 3 times, and they stopped. And so they were able at that point to turn and run for the river. And they made it to the river. They were able to get across because Union artillery showed up and was giving them supporting fire. But they lost probably 150 men drowned in the river as they were crossing. So that it was not a good situation. And so after that, they went into the fences of Washington. They didn't go to the Antietam campaign. They weren't involved in that. They just rested and recuperated. the 74th at this point was down from a total of 800 men the year before, and was now at about 333. So they had lost 500 men in the span of a year, most of them from disease and weather and drowning and one thing or another. So but these 333 were a battle hardened group. They hung together for the remainder of the war. They were, and then, they were marched down during the Fredericksburg campaign toward Fredericksburg, but they didn't get there in time. So they sat out the winter after the Battle of Fredericksburg in December of 1862. They spent the winter just outside of Stafford Courthouse. And there's now a battlefield park there, which actually has the campground where the 74th Pennsylvania was camped. It's marked off there. You can go actually and visit where they spent the winter of 1862, 1863. They then were involved in the Chancellorsville campaign, and in that battle, they had crossed the river in the night and had gone out on the Orange Plank Road out west of Fredericksburg toward Chancellorsville or beyond Chancellorsville. And, the regiment was put in line on the road facing south. And General Schimmelpfennig was at that point, he was commanding the brigade, and he lived in an ambulance. He slept in the ambulance. In this case, he was sleeping underneath the ambulance. But all of his officers were from the 74th Pennsylvania. All the senior officers were out and seeing that Jackson was marching around the flank. And they kept coming back and reporting, hey, we're in a trap. And they kept going to Howard and saying, we're in a trap. And Howard kept saying, well, you're German and I don't believe you. You're immigrants, you're stupid. So he just ignored their repeated, entreaties that they were in a trap. Now, these guys, they were ready, they stood their ground, but the 17th Connecticut was another regiment that was with them. It was right adjacent to them. It was with another division. And they were at right angles, basically, to the 74th Pennsylvania. When they were attacked, and this is important, the major in command of the 17th Connecticut panicked, and he shouted out to his men, "Every man for yourself." And so the whole regiment just ran. Well, the 74th was in line on the road, and it was a narrow road. And if you can imagine having 500 men run through the ranks, it completely destroyed the cohesion of the 74th. The 74th broke up into 3 separate groups, and were barely able to meet the attack from the Confederates. But they did, and they fought as individual groups and retreated eastward through the Bushbeck line and further. And the color guard was actually, they were all commended because they kept the colors and didn't flee. They stood their ground. So that was a really good thing for the morale of the unit. A lot of men were taken prisoner, including Lieutenant Colonel von Bitzel. And this is important too for him because Colonel von Bitzel, this was his first time to be captured, and he was sent to Libby Prison in Richmond. And I'm sure some of you have heard of Libby Prison, which was a notorious prison in Richmond. He spent 10 days there before he was paroled, but he was able to get familiar with the facility. This was important because when he was taken prisoner at Gettysburg, he went back to Libby Prison. After Chancellorsville, the regiment was pulled together. Schimmelpfennig spent 5 days in a funk in a tent drinking alcohol, which he was a teetotaler, so that was totally out of character. But he couldn't otherwise deal with all these Yankee officers who he thought were totally incompetent. So eventually they moved north in the Gettysburg campaign. Lieutenant Colonel Van Mitzel rejoined the regiment, and he was put in command of the screen that was marching to the west of the 11th Corps. These were the men that were actually fighting Confederate skirmishers, trying to keep them from finding the Union Army. So he would lead 400 to 500 men from several different regiments, and they were screening. And in fact, on the day of the first day of the Battle of Gettysburg, these men were further west. They were 10 miles west, and it took them half the day to get there and get caught up. So they actually arrived late in the battle, and at that point, the 74th Pennsylvania fought as two separate battalions, two separate units, one of 100 men, one of 200 men. And that's important to remember, because when you see a lot of the histories of the 74th Pennsylvania, these histories that show where the 74th Pennsylvania was in Gettysburg, they're all wrong. And I've had this debate with a lot of the authors, but they just weren't where they're posited to be. When they arrived in Gettysburg, the 1st Battalion, which was 130 men under Colonel von Hartung, they were the 2nd Regiment on the field after the 61st Ohio. If you read any book you see will say, no, it was the 45th New York. Well, no, the 45th New York was the 3rd Regiment on the field. The 61st Ohio was the 1st on the field. It was carrying General Schurz's battle flags. He was on the field with them, and then the 74th came right behind them. Those two regiments deployed north as skirmishers. They immediately ran into combat with the Alabama sharpshooters. These were all highly trained sharpshooters, snipers. They were well equipped, and they were very good at picking off officers. And at this point, Colonel von Hartung, north of the town, was shot off his horse. He was shot through the leg, and he fell from the horse and had to be carried off the field. My ancestor, Joseph Neumeyer, who was a lieutenant, was shot through the chest. The bullet actually went completely through his body, but it knocked him unconscious. And he was found by two nuns 3 days later on July 4th, still alive, but unconscious, right where he lay when he was shot. A lot of the officers were killed. Lieutenant Roth was shot through the head by a sniper as he crossed a creek. They went down into there's a low kind of swale that's between Oak Hill, which is where all the Confederate artillery was, looking down on the town of Gettysburg. So they were kind of in a little bit of a protected area, but they were, it was a pretty uncomfortable place for them to be. And they were there up until they saw Gordon's brigade start to cut behind the Krzyzanowski's brigade, which was the other brigade in General Schurz's division. The Gordon's men were cutting between Schimmelpfennig's brigade and Krzyzanowski's brigade. And in fact, one of the officers was Captain Krausneck, who would get to command in Gettysburg by the end of the day. Captain Krausneck was lost on the battlefield. He couldn't find the 74th because they were down in this swale, and he was hunting and hunting and hunting for them. And he came up alongside Krzyzanowski's brigade, and he was to the left of them. And he saw Krzyzanowski, who was on the left flank riding his horse. And he was trying to call to Krzyzanowski. He was about 50 yards apart. They were about 50 yards apart. He was trying to call him and say, where's my brigade? And at that point, Krzyzanowski was looking straight at him and said, damn and shit. At that point, the Confederates stood up out of the road and opened up a volley right into the flank of his brigade. and began to tear him apart. And Krausnick just ran, he just fled. At that point, Schimmelpfennig, who was further off the field, further to the west, sent the 157th New York up to try to reinforce. It was 400 men. It was a Green regiment. It was the newest regiment in his brigade. He sent them to try to rescue Krasnowski, and they got in a crossfire with the Confederates. And in a matter of 15 minutes, 285 men were killed out of 400, or killed or wounded. So that regiment just evaporated. At that point, the rest of the front just collapsed, and the 74th retreated. They retreated back to the college, in the grounds of the college, Gettysburg College, and that's where Schimmelpfennig stopped and decided that that's where he was going to stand and fight. At that point, the right wing of the First Corps was already retreating, and the 11th Corps was retreating to his right. So on both sides of him, the front had collapsed, and the Schimmelpfennig's brigade, including this 1st Battalion of the 74th, were the last men on the north end of town. Their stand where they were delayed the Confederates enough that a couple thousand men, particularly from the First Corps, were able to retreat down the unfinished railroad and get into town and get away. Had they not stood there, the Confederates could have cut off those men and taken a couple thousand men prisoner, but they weren't able to do that. But because they made this stand, they weren't able to get out of the town. They got trapped in the town, and they decided that about 100 men were going to stand and make a forlorn hope. They were going to stand and fight to the end, so that the rest of the brigade could retreat. And I don't know if you all know Gettysburg very well. The Lutheran Church, which is near the town square, the soldiers tore down the fences on either side of it and started through the alleyways. And the 100 men that were left behind to fight, they all got into the buildings to the north side of the Lutheran Church up toward the train station. And they hung out, they held out there, delaying the Confederate movement through the town as the rest of the regiment escaped through the regiments escaped down through the alleyways. Those men eventually, under Captain Ersch of the 45th New York, were surrounded, and during the night, he was offered terms, and they took him on a tour of the town to show that there were no more Union troops there. And at that point, he agreed to surrender. They took all their weapons, threw them down wells, and surrendered. And I'm kind of going to move one more then, which is the 2nd Battalion of the 74th had arrived as the other part of the regiment. The other battalion was at the college. The 2nd Battalion arrived with 200 men under Lieutenant Colonel von Mitzel. They came up through the center of the town, through the Diamond, up to the Harrisburg Road, and they were ordered at that point to hold the road at all costs to protect the retreat. Now, the important thing about this is that order is kind of is when you read it, it's kind of in a vacuum. But what they were doing was, if you all remember, there was Coster's Brigade, which was a reserve brigade that was brought up to the Brickyard to protect the retreat. They were massacred. Coster's Brigade, all 3 regiments were massacred. The 74th Pennsylvania was on the left wing of Coster's Brigade. You will never see that mentioned in any history. They were overrun with Coster. 50 men were taken prisoner, a number were killed, including Lieutenant Colonel Mitzel. He was taken prisoner again. So they were all shipped off south to the Confederacy. So, but the survivors were able to get back to Cemetery Hill, and they were grouped on the southwest corner or the northwest corner of the hill, face the part of the hill on the cemetery, the part of the cemetery that is closest to the town. Now it's all in the town, but at that point it was the closest part to the town, which was about 100 yards. They stayed there, you know, through that night and the next day. And at that point, on July 2nd, there was a Confederate attack on Cemetery Hill, East Cemetery Hill. And, you know, but they were, as they were massing, you know, the Union officers noticed this. And so they pulled the 74th Pennsylvania out of line and sent it to reinforce the northeast corner, you know, East Cemetery Hill. There's a statue there right now of General Howard on horseback, which is the area where they were sent to. And they were sent down into a long wall at the base of the hill. And that is where they were struck by the 9th North Carolina and the 8th Louisiana. And they were involved in hand-to-hand combat. My great-great-great-grandfather, John Reeser, who was the oldest man in the regiment, at that point, he was 60 years old. He was a captain. He fought with. Had been a hussar cavalryman in the French army, and he fought hand to hand with a sword against North Carolinians and Louisianans along the fence line there, which is still there. The stone wall is still there. Now, the regiments on either side of the 74th broke and fled, and Confederates got in behind them on both sides, but they never left the wall. They fought at the wall, you know, the whole night until they were relieved by other Union troops that came over the hill. Now, the important thing about this from the standpoint of record keeping, the reason that the 74th is not remembered for having fought on East Cemetery Hill is because they were put under the command of the man in the 17th Connecticut who had ordered his men to run away at Chancellorsville. And he didn't want anyone in the 74th to get any credit for being there and saving his butt a second time. So when he reported that the 74th showed up, he said they were 300 stragglers. He had no idea who they were. They had no commander. He had no idea who they were. But they were there and they fought. And you will never see any marker for the 74th Pennsylvania on East Cemetery Hill, nor any history that mentions them, but that's where they were. So when you go to Gettysburg, you go East Cemetery Hill, that's where they fought. That after that night, they moved back to the northwest corner of Cemetery Hill, and during the bombardments on July 3rd, they decided Schleider, who was Schleider, was an adjutant to Schimmelpfennig, and he was partially paralyzed in his left leg and left arm from having gotten smallpox in 1862. Schleider decided that they were receiving sniper fire from the town, and he wasn't going to put up with that. So he rounded up 25 men, and they crawled through the grass up into the town. And Rod, I'm drawing a blank here. The restaurant we always go to.
The Gettysburg Inn.
Yeah, the Gettysburg Inn. They crawled up there and they were shooting the Confederate snipers out of the windows and driving them back. And they spent most of July 3rd, these 25 men fighting in the town against Confederate snipers and trying to keep them from shooting the men that were manning the guns on the hill behind them. Now, 3 of the 74th men got particularly annoying because they crawled up into the second floor of what was then the Wagon Hotel. It's now the gas station that's right on the intersection there, where the Baltimore Street and the Emmitsburg Pike come together. There's I can't even remember what it's not a Wawa, but there's a gas station there. It was the Wagon Hotel. It was a 2-story hotel. And they were in the upper floor, and they were particularly good at hitting people. So the Confederates decided they had artillery that was about a mile away that had nothing to shoot at. So they started firing shot at the hotel, and they actually landed 3 solid shots through the window where these guys were and killed 2 of them outright. So they pulled out of the Wagon Hotel, but they remained there, overnight. And in the early morning hours of July 4th, about 3:00 in the morning, Schleider decided, I'm going to attack. We're going to go into town. And as he advanced up the street with his men, they were the first Union troops into Gettysburg. They were there hours before any other troops got in there. They made it all the way up to the Diamond. They took about 40 prisoners. And along the way, they liberated Alexander Schimmelpfennig, who was hiding because he had gotten trapped during the escape from the Lutheran Church. So they found him, and he decided that he was going to go into one of the houses and raid him for eggs, because he hadn't eaten in 2 days. And he cooked up some eggs, some scrambled eggs, and General Schurz came striding up the street, and they had breakfast together on the street. So that's how they spent the day. So then they, after Gettysburg, Schimmelpfennig was finished with, as far as serving under Howard. He decided Howard was incompetent, and so they were trying to reorganize because they had to bring in a lot of new troops to bring the regiments up. And Schimmelpfennig said he would no longer serve in the Army of the Potomac. He wanted to be transferred somewhere else. And he made clear, though, that he wanted the 74th to go with him. And that's exactly what they did, is when he was discharged of his duties, the 74th went with him. They went separately. They pulled together a couple of other units and made a brigade. And then they went south from there to South Carolina, while as the rest of the 11th Corps went to Chattanooga. So then they went south. They went to South Carolina, and in South Carolina they spent the better part of a year on the islands outside of Charleston. It was kind of a miserable existence. They lived on Coles Island, which was a flooded, sandy island. It was a very miserable place. But Company G was taken out of the regiment at that point and was made into an independent rocket battery. They were the only rocket battery in the Union Army. They used them because it was difficult to move cannon across the swamps. But they could move these rockets all over the place. They also put them on surf boats, which were what the coast life preservers would go out. They would, for rescuing ships that were damaged or sinking off the coast. They would take these surf boats. They would mount a rocket on the bow. And then they would go out with 10 or 12 men, and they would patrol through the swamps on the channels, hunting for Confederate troops that were trying to sneak in as well. So they would have several battles where they would fight from boat to boat, firing rockets at the other enemy boats. But they got involved in a number of battles, James Island and Jones Island, which were relatively small. They were not significant encounters or battles. And at that point, the 74th was close to being up on its service in the summer of 1864. And so the regiment they decided to pull the regiment and bring it back to Washington, D.C. But one little aside, parallel to this, the prisoners of the 74th Pennsylvania that had been taken to Gettysburg, most of them were at Libby Prison. Lieutenant Colonel von Mitzel was not a happy camper in Libby. This was, remember, it was his second stint there. And he was, he decided that this was not a place for him and he was going to find a way out. Well, he joined with a group of men, there were 15 of them, who decided that they had a spoon and they were going to dig a tunnel. And they did. So, but you'll find when you look at histories of the Great Libby escape, there was a Lieutenant Colonel Mitchell who was involved, who was, a Yankee, but Mitchell was actually Mitzel, and he was involved directly. And in this escape on February 9th of 1864, which was a very, very cold day, there was a lot of ice in the river, which you can imagine, and we don't get much ice in our rivers anymore, and certainly not in the James. But he and 109 Union officers escaped through the tunnel and were able to get out of Libby Prison. It was the largest mass escape in the history of the Civil War. Now, of those 109, only 3 made it to Union lines. One of those was von Mitzel. He made it. Captain Ersch was captured. The other 74thers that broke out, they were all captured. But von Mitzel made it out, and he was able to rejoin the regiment just in time for it to be disbanded, which was sort of sad, but he accomplished what he was set out to do. Now, it did, unfortunately, hiding in the rivers with ice cold water really damaged his health, and he died at a young age, about 1880. But at that point, he was doing very well financially. He was the Anheuser-Busch distributor for Baltimore, so he was doing real well in the lager business. So, Anheuser's, I'm drawing a blank on Anheuser's first name. He was out of St. Louis, but he took care of von Mitzel's widow, made sure that she was taken care of. So she did well. And his son became a very famous actor who traveled around the country as a theatrical actor. But at that point, the regiment was being disbanded. They were at Fort Marcy, which overlooks the Potomac River, just west of the city of D.C. Of the 9 companies of the 74th. Because there was never more than 9. Most regiments have 10 companies, but the 74th only ever had 9, the old 74th. Of that, 6 of those companies were disbanded. The men wanted to go home. 3, there were enough men to fill 3 companies that re-enlisted as veteran volunteers. And those men were sent to Green Springs, West Virginia, on the Potomac, near where Kaiser is today. And that's where they were joined by 7 new companies. So this is where you get from the old regiment to the new. And this is where there's a lot of confusion in the history of the 74th in Bates, which was the famous book that has all the histories and the muster rolls. The problem with Bates is they mix and match. They don't show all the men from the old 74th. They only show the men that went in with the new 74th. And so there's kind of a mixture there, and it's very confusing. And most of the information in there is wrong, which is unfortunate. But these new folks came in. Most of them had no German, they weren't Germans. They were ordinary Scotch-Irish, English Americans from Pennsylvania. They were very unhappy with the being put in with a bunch of Germans. protecting a railroad against bushwhackers. And so in their boredom, they decided in the spring of 1865 that, they had had enough of being ordered around by Gottlieb Hoberg and Wittenheimer and Friedrich Klenker, the colonel, the lieutenant colonel, and the major at this point, and decided that we're going to have a mutiny and we're going to overthrow these guys, and we're going to make it an American regiment, not a German regiment. Well, they had a vote, and when they thought they had the votes to do this, they didn't have the votes, and so all these officers that had tried to mutiny and overthrow the existing guys were thrown out of the regiment in the early May of 1865. The regiment then, it continued with its duty of protecting the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad through West Virginia up until June of 1865, when it was finally disbanded and the men went home. So that's kind of, it's a long story. But it's in a nutshell. There's a lot more detail than that. But at this point, I'll let that go because we got like 15 minutes, and I'll just say if anybody's got questions, I have histories on each individual company and on every single man that served in the regiment. I have a biography. So I'll leave it to y'all.
So I said the wrong place. It's the Farnsworth House.
Yeah.
I do continually say that we owe them. Just go there, buy whatever. We owe them. If you don't understand, look at the outside brick wall.
If you see the brick wall on the Farnsworth House, there are all these bullet holes on the south wall. Those were all bullets put in there by the 74th Pennsylvania.
So Bret, one of the questions that comes up from Daniel Evan, which is great because on the Facebook site, Daniel has the amazing pictures of the flag, and also on the website of the monument and the flag. Some would argue, I argue he's the regimental photographer. He just doesn't know he's been designated that. And so he is interested about, is there a specific book with muster rolls of the 74th Company G for the first 2 years of the war?
There is not, but I can send you it. I have it. I have a complete listing of every single man that served in the regiment. It's the only thing. It's the only list there is, and it's taken a long time to put together. But I'm happy to make it available to you. Is there a particular individual he's interested in?
His name is Bernard Pitchell.
Oh, I know that name. Wait, hold on here. I apologize. Let me see. Bernhard Pitchell, born 16 May 1837 in Petschau near Vienna, the Austrian Empire. Immigrated 1855. Died 3rd August 1888 in Cincinnati, Ohio.
That's right. That's amazing. Thank you. I'd love to get that information.
Absolutely. Absolutely. His nephew was Colonel James Faulkner Pitchell, who was a graduate of the United States Military Academy at West Point, class of 1918.
Yeah, I have pictures of him.
Yeah. So yeah, I have all of this. I've got a lot of family information on every single member.
Wow.
Pitchell served on Douglas MacArthur's staff during the Second World War too. Did you know that?
No. Faulkner. Yeah. Okay. Wow.
Yeah.
I have a question regarding the colors. So I don't know if all of you have seen it, but it blew my mind when I went to the Pennsylvania State Archive and found the massive flag that was used during the color guard for the 74th. But the pole, unlike all the rest of the pole's a branch from a tree. And I don't know if there's a story there. I'm sure there is, but.
As I understand it, they didn't take the original pole with them from Pennsylvania to South Carolina.
Okay.
It was something they found on Coles Island.
Thank you.
So yeah, it was whatever you could do to find it, you use whatever you could. The flag was actually given to them. It was presented to them in, I'm trying to remember here, December of 1861 at a ceremony where 4 German regiments received flags. It was a congressional delegation presented the flags. They were gifts from Governor Curtin. He bought the flag, had them made, and had them presented in Virginia at a place called Roach's Mill, which is, I don't know if you know Alexandria very well, but it's a 4-mile run. It runs just west of Alexandria.
Flags were made, huh?
Anybody else?
Yes, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Hi, this is David Braun. My ancestor was, let me leave the room, it's a little noisy here, was Arnold Meckelberg, and he had a brother, Friedrich Meckelberg, and it's either in Company B or Company C from the early beginning. Family legend has it that Arnold Meckelberg recruited the company, and therefore he became the captain of the company, which
That is true.
That was okay.
He was a member of the Pittsburgh Turnverein.
Yeah.
So he was a Turner. He recruited the Turner Rifles, Company B, and he recruited his brother. So he was also a Turner. So it was Heinrich.
Heinrich, yeah, right.
And
Okay. He was supposed to have been a pharmacist in the German Navy, and
He was-
I
yes, yeah.
I never could figure out. I didn't know that Germany was Germany at the time, or is it Prussian Navy, or I can't figure out what that means exactly.
Well, he was born in 1832 in the Grand Duchy of Oldenburg, which was actually ruled by the Russians, the Romanovs. And they're on the coast, it's northwest of Hamburg. So they had a small merchant marine, but he could very well, I don't know for sure, but he could have served in the Russian Navy.
You can ask him separately about Grau.
So
Okay.
I mean, a little more on that. I have a lot on him. I've got a lot of information here on him.
Okay.
So,
How do you get information out? Do I just ask for it, or how would I get it?
yeah, I'm happy to send it to you. I think if Rod has your emails and everything, I'd be happy to send it to you.
I believe so. Yeah.
Let me know what you're looking for specifically, and I'm happy to send it to you.
Well, this is just some family tree info, stories. I don't know if they have any stories or just details, but either way.
Yeah, some of these I have a lot more detail on it than others. I know he lived in Beaver Falls. He went to Emmanuel Church.
Right.
Married Anna, who was born in 1844. I have the list of all their children, what he did, where he worked, I have all that kind of information. So I'm happy to share.
Well, yeah. Ron, do you have my information?
David, just send me a note again saying requesting information on Ancestor X, and I I put out to everybody my email in the chat, and
Okay.
and just send those to me, and I'll bounce them over to John and Brett and I. And John's agreed to be the one to keep Brett and I somewhat on task.
Okay.
He doesn't understand. He doesn't understand what he's agreed to, and so just send that to me, and we'll do that. And then, Brett, there's this great question in the chat that I just love because I didn't solicit it, I didn't ask for it. But can you tell us, Brett, how the muster rolls were lost?
They weren't lost by my relatives. They were reconstructed by John Reitzer. After the Battle of Second Bull Run, which the 74th Pennsylvania, I didn't go into detail with the Second Bull Run, but the 74th Pennsylvania Second Bull Run was the only regiment to get across the unfinished railroad in the attack against Jackson. They actually got across the unfinished railroad and realized they were the only ones there, so it was a good idea to stay. But then they were actually, the 74th Pennsylvania and the 61st Ohio were the rear guard of the entire Union Army. When it retreated back into Fairfax County over the Stone Bridge, the 74th Pennsylvania was the last unit across the bridge and actually pulled down the bridge behind the Union Army. It took them 3 hours to do that. But the problem was they left behind all their wagons with all their records, and all those records got burned by the Confederates. So my great-great-great-grandfather had the luck or unluck of having to try to reconstruct all of that. And so all the existing records that are in the Library of Congress, are in the National Archives, are in his handwriting. So there, Gerard.
I pointed out, this is one of my favorite stories because it's like, blame it on the officer. And it's even better because Brett has to reconstruct it again. So this is like the third time his family has done this. So Lexi, you want him to get this right or else you're screwed, friend. That's all I'm going to say.
I'm looking to Steven. He's going to have to do this from now on.
Just have him get it right, Lex.
So,
and then Daniel, you've got one more.
Yeah, so
Watching the
I
time.
just cannot imagine. I'm a professor of photography, but I just cannot imagine how you cannot write a book, Brett.
Oh, I've got 9 pages. It's just organizing it and making it, into something. I've got a publisher with the University of Nebraska Press, and they're and I'm trying to get this turned into a book.
The knowledge is incredible. Wow.
Unfortunately, all the biographies are not considered valuable as far as a book is concerned. So at some point, once I get my book out, then we'll probably put all of these biographies and all the muster roll on the website, and they'll be open for public.
He's getting ready to
I can share everything with you all anyway.
So we're getting close to the end of our time, and I just want to be respectful of that. And if folks have to go, feel free to. I will say, Brett, there's one. So Daniel, you've taken pictures of the monument,
Like when he says
and of
that's
the
not
flag. But Daniel, there's another artifact. Apparently, you might want to see if you're closer, you can take pictures of. And Brett, what's that? There's 1 + 1 missing one.
Yeah, Bertha Schimmelpfennig, who was Schimmelpfennig's daughter, donated his 2 swords, his presentation sword and his combat sword, to the archives in Harrisburg, and they're there. Now, the problem is they were donated in 1915 as a pair. If you go there now, they say, oh, we only have 1 sword, which is his presentation sword. But that, it'd be nice to have some decent pictures of that. I have a photo of it, but it's terrible.
So I will try to make a point to drive there this summer. It's about 8 hours, but when I was there last, the curator told me that they were building a new building that the flags were going to all move into. I don't know if that happened.
I don't know. I haven't been there in couple of years. So.
But I'll check on that. I'll try to get both sorts.
Now, the other thing, just this little tidbit with Schimmelfennig. I know all of you are familiar with the book Heidi and the movie Heidi. The English version of that, the first time it was translated was by Helene White Schimmelfennig. She was Schimmelfennig's daughter, and she was the translator of Heidi for Joanna Spry, who wrote the book. So just a little tidbit of 74 Pennsylvania here, history there.
It looks like the building has been built and is open. So.
Oh, okay.
Okay, folks. So that's our time. What I'm going to suggest is that maybe we give some thought to doing another one of these in the fall. And then do it where we see if there's stories or other things that we can highlight or bring forward. And it is, to me, it's great to see faces and hear voices to emails that I've known for decades, which is just awesome on so many levels. And again, this is also on Facebook. So the recording's there. So the minute we get done, if you're like, wait a sec, I want to go back and play that, or I got up to get, a glass of iced tea, not identifying anybody in particular, and I want to go back and listen to that segment, I can do that. And so it's there. I would say if you've got questions, please put that there. And then David, it looks like you've got a question, or is your hand up?
I'm just steadying myself on the stairs.
Okay.
I'm good.
And so we'll do this again. And Deke lives in Harrisburg. So Deke, maybe you should make some inquiries about the two swords and post some notes there on the Facebook page. I know others follow that when things get posted. And with that, enjoy your spring and summer. Thank you, everybody, for doing this. It was a lot of fun. And we will do another one in the fall. And then by then, we'll also have some ideas about the fall of 2022. I've already started making a list of notes. Having done this many years ago, I remember what didn't work well. So I will let others arrange the weather, because that we did in spring and it snowed, hailed, rained, sunny, and that was all in the first hour, if I remember right. It was a cold day. So, all right, take care. It's great seeing you all. Bye, Lax.
Thanks for getting this organized. Thank you.
All right, thank you. Bye-bye.
Outstanding, Brett. Thanks.
Thank you.
Yeah, great
Who's
job,
there?
Brett.
Hi, Heidi.
Thanks,
Hi.
Dad.
Love you.
Happy birthday.
Thank you.
You made her do this on her birthday?
Yeah,
My
he did.
sister. My sister's
No.
birthday.
Wow, Lexi. I mean, that's
was
even more than what we made you
wonderful.
endure.
It was wonderful. Thank you
Okay.
very much, Sesto.
All right, I'm going to end it all. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.